Hello and welcome. I'm Jacqueline Sawyer, the VP of Education and Engagement at the National Building Museum. Thank you for joining us for the next program in our timely and important series, Climate ABC. For over 4 decades, the National Building Museum has presented celebrated exhibitions and programs that have touched on everything from design and construction to social justice and equity. Our mission is to educate and engage people about the built environment and its impact on our lives and communities. As a primary driver of global warming, carbon emissions impact everything from the future of coastal cities to the extreme weather that threatens communities across the country and around the world. The built environment is responsible for nearly 40% of carbon emissions worldwide. And the Building Museum is committed to offering programs that educate and empower innovative and positive action on this topic. We've been at the forefront of sustainability and resilience topics for nearly 20 years, beginning with our 2003 exhibition, Big and Green, towards sustainable architecture in the 21st century, and continuing with our Smart Growth and For the Greener Good series. Climate ABC, which stands for Action, Building, and Community, focuses on 3 essential aspects of addressing climate change: actions by individuals, businesses, nonprofits, policymakers, and civic entities; examples of building both physical structures and landscapes, as well as coalitions of stakeholders and communities at every scale that are working to reduce carbon emissions. I want to thank and recognize Wholesome, the lead sponsor of Climate ABC, and Joseph Massett, VP of Strategy and Commercial Excellence, for his role in providing us with valuable support we needed to undertake this important work. Joseph couldn't be with us today, but sends us a taped message. Let's take a listen.
At the Wholesome family of companies, we're proud to support the National Building Museum's Climate ABC series. Innovation, collaboration, looking at the whole picture. All these are key elements to bring real change, and this series touches on each one of them. Taking meaningful steps to minimize our environmental impact is everyone's responsibility. At Wholesome, we take this seriously and are committed to building a net zero future. We're on our way with our low carbon cements and concretes, our recycled aggregates and asphalt offerings, and our roofing solutions that significantly increase the energy efficiency of any building. But we're just getting started. The opportunities to rethink and transform the built environment are substantial. So let's take up the challenge. Let's do it together, and let's do it right now. On behalf of Wholesome, I want to thank the National Building Museum for the opportunity, and Eileen for her leadership.
Thank you again, Joseph and Wholesome, for your generous support. I would like to recognize C40 Cities as our lead partner. Thank you also to our donors, EYP, AIA, ASLA, and Studios Architecture. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator, Chris Cooper.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Appreciate that. And I feel fired up after Wholesome's presentation. So my name's Chris Cooper. I'll be the moderator tonight. I'm an architect, partner at SOM in our New York office. And I've been working with a collection of experts, city designers, architects, engineers, material and technology specialists, and advocates on the development of a concept that changes the way we think about buildings and cities. So we're very excited to share that thinking with you tonight and to talk about that as a group. To begin the evening, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have 4 terrific panelists with us tonight. The first is Yasemin. Yasemin Kologlu is a principal at SOM in our New York office. And she's known here and outside of SOM for her forward-thinking and holistic approach to design that integrates well-being, environmental design, and technology. She's the firm-wide leader of SOM's Global Climate Action Group, which promotes stronger sustainable practices in our own practice. She's part of the Carbon Leadership Forum in New York, Steering Committee, and AIA's New York Committee on the Environment, and the Building Energy Exchange Architect Advisory Council. She's contributed to industry advisory groups that are shaping New York and state policies on carbon and on energy. And Yasemin, very importantly tonight, led our team of architects and engineers in the design of our prototype Urban Sequoia. So panelist number one is Yasemin. Our next panelist is Chris Neidl. And Chris has focused much of his career facilitating on-grid and off-grid clean energy adoption in the United States, in Asia, and in Africa. He's really been an active force in the global adoption of solar energy. But Chris has turned his attention to active carbon removal and is the co-founder of OpenAir Collective, a global volunteer network launched to accelerate carbon removal, through research and development, policy, and activism. So another very important component of our conversation tonight. In his role as at OpenAir Collective, Chris is a leader in developing pro-carbon dioxide removal policies that push our cities and states towards decarbonization faster. And these include the Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Act and tax abatement for direct carbon capture. And these are being adopted in New York, New Jersey, Virginia, and elsewhere, really significant policies to make change. Chris also serves as an advisor to 2 open source miniature direct air carbon capture development projects. I think Violet and Cyan are their names. And what I love, Chris is a self-proclaimed carbon removal evangelist. So Chris, thanks for joining us. Next, our third panelist is Wil Srubar. Wil is an associate professor of civil and architectural engineering and materials science at the University of Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, where he leads the Living Materials Laboratory. Wil is recognized as a pioneer in carbon sequestering material research. His laboratory at the University of Colorado Boulder focuses on development and commercialization of low carbon and carbon storing material technologies for the built environment. Relating to his research, Wil is co-founder of several startups, including Prometheus Materials, which is focused on biobrick development, and Aureus Earth, a carbon trading platform that for carbon removed from buildings. All particularly relevant. As you can see, this is starting to form a story here. And our fourth panelist is Kira Gould. Kira is a writer, a strategist, a convener focused on advancing design leadership and climate action. She's a senior fellow with Architecture 2030. And for the architects in the audience, you know that that is completely transforming how we build today. And Kira serves on the American Institute of Architects Committee on the Environment at a national leadership level. Through Kira Gould CONNECT, you should all look that up. She provides strategic communications for leaders designing, developing, and building the sustainable future. Kira co-hosts the Design the Future podcast with Lindsay Baker and co-authored the book Women in Green: Voices of Sustainable Design. So thank you for listening to the introduction. I think it's important for everybody to understand the who is here speaking tonight. And in simple terms, we've convened an architect, a technology specialist, a material science engineer, and a strategist, all with a clear mission to make change happen. So I'll be the moderator tonight, and I think we'll jump into a conversation. And I will start by saying, I think by now we are all aware that buildings are responsible for a large percentage of our global carbon emissions, 40%. And cities, a mere 1% of the Earth's surface, contribute 75% of global emissions. So our built environment is in an imbalance with the natural environment. We keep hearing about the net zero carbon goal. And in response, our industry is laser focused on carbon reduction. LEED, AIA 2030, ESG reporting, they're all quantifiable goal-setting mechanisms that are helping us get to net zero. But the unsavory truth, let's say, is that if we only aim for net zero, we likely will have squandered the 2 degrees Celsius chance that we have to actually secure the future of our planet. And so the targets that we have all set and agreed to, the goals are not in line with the urgency. So there's no second chance on this. And this is why we need a carbon negative future. So tonight, we'll talk about a very powerful concept, designing buildings that can remove carbon from the atmosphere, and expanding that to cities that work as a network of carbon absorbing buildings and streetscapes. So imagine flipping our reality. Buildings and cities become the solution to our climate crisis rather than the source. This is entirely within our reach. With recent advancements, the advancements of many, and the efforts of us all, we can collectively achieve a new standard of building. So we're going to share a video, and then we'll jump into a conversation. The video is a bit of a teaser, but it tries to put forward the concept, this idea of urban sequoia, which is again buildings absorbing carbon. And I hope that for the audience that you have a lot of questions based on that, and we'll have a moment actually to bring those forward. But we'll try to answer some of those, and I'd like to point the conversation first to Yasemin. And Yasemin, after the video, which puts the concept out in broad level, it would be great if you would take a few minutes to describe the urban sequoia concept in more detail. First, perhaps relative to the design of a specific building, and how we might shift beyond net zero to actual carbon sequestering buildings and environment.
Thank you, Chris. And it's a pleasure to be here with everybody and with everyone on the panel as well. I mean, as you mentioned, I think it was this idea, this prototype, this design was for us to think of different ways of absorbing carbon and making a built environment be part of the solution, as you said. And this required almost like a mindset change in the way how we design buildings. So rather than actually trying to reduce carbon in materials, in operations of the building, etc., we were actively trying to understand what do we need to do to actually absorb carbon in the process and through the life of the building. So for this, we had to work in different aspects of the design. So we started with structural optimization, structural design, modular design, and using some of these tools that we tried to use already in different projects already started making reductions for us. But then we quickly realized that in order to get to an absorbing position, we need to go beyond this. We need to work with innovative materials, bio-based materials, such as bio-brick and bioplastics. And these are the type of materials that Wil, for example, in his laboratory works with. These are the materials that are inspired by nature and inspired by phenomena like photosynthesis, that during their production process, they absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And this is just their natural process. And could we imagine a world where we use more of these materials? Hence, we propose maybe looking into some of this new generation of materials. And in addition to that, we also looked at technology-based solutions. And these are some of the carbon capturing technologies we briefly touched on. And these technologies, these are machines that exist currently, actually, in the shape of farms, kind of direct air capture farms, similar to maybe what PVs used to do back in the day. And these are machines that directly capture carbon from the atmosphere. As the air flows through, they capture the carbon, and then the carbon can be bottled or directed to other industries to be used as building materials. So how can we integrate? Our design looked at how we could integrate this type of technological advancement into the building physics. So can we actually use stack effect, for example, to pull air through the building and use carbon capture technology within that to actually push air through the machine to capture that carbon? So it allowed us to work very specifically about how different technologies, innovative materials can be incorporated, but also it allows us to think about design differently and work with people such as Wil and Chris, also with the industry and others in the industry to innovate together, collaborate together, and find solutions in the built environment that are going beyond the zero goal, beyond the reduction goal, and actually make buildings, design buildings that can be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Awesome.
And maybe one last thing I wanted to add is, we show the prototype, a high-rise prototype in what we showed today. I want to emphasize this is a prototype. So we were it was very important for us that the technologies, the systems, the design ideas we created here are applicable to multiple scales. So these could apply to small, large, short, tall. So we're not suggesting that one size, one scale is a solution to everything. Instead, we picked one that was fairly challenging as a high rise and tried to solve that. And the answers that we found here could be also answers at different scales too.
Awesome. So I might summarize a little bit a sequence of number one, optimize design to reduce embodied carbon. Two, incorporate materials that actually absorb carbon. And three, implement technology. Right. That's so maybe so given that sequence, Wil, Yasemin described the role of construction materials in building a carbon sequestering future. It'd be great if you could maybe first distinguish for us low carbon building materials versus carbon absorbing materials, and maybe share with us some of the most promising advancements.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my part of this conversation is going to be focusing on that embodied carbon piece of the pie, which is a third when we think about 40% of all global CO2 emissions due to buildings. About 2/3 is due to operational, what we call operational carbon emissions. It's the electricity, heating, air conditioning, but a third is due to the emissions associated with the material production, use, disposal. So the so-called embodied carbon problem. And this has really been brought to light, especially over the last decade, that many of the common building materials that we choose to use are net carbon emitters. They're actually CO2 intensive to produce: steel, concrete, and insulation materials being the most intensive from a carbon footprint standpoint. Now, the industry has taken notice, and manufacturers have understood this, and now there is. What's exciting is there's now a nationwide effort. It's not just certain regions of the country. There's a nationwide effort, and even global effort to understand these emissions and to produce products and to specify products that are lower embodied carbon emissions. So these are products that exhibit lower process emissions than the conventional counterparts. But what's really pertinent to this conversation, and where so glad we're focusing a lot of the conversation today, is on carbon negative materials, carbon sequestering materials, carbon storing materials. So I think at the very beginning, we were talking about getting to net zero, just reducing all of the emissions and having the materiality be carbon neutral is not going to be enough. We have a huge opportunity with the momentum of building to specify materials in our built environment that are net carbon storing, net carbon sequestering. So as a material scientist, I think, okay, great. This sounds awesome. How do we produce materials that sequester and store more carbon than is emitted in their manufacture? And really, we have two mechanisms to play with. One, Yasemin mentioned already, it's photosynthesis. So every photosynthetic organism on the planet, whether it be trees or hemp or straw, even algae, all of those photosynthetic organisms take CO2 to build their biomass. So the physicality of what they produce is net CO2 storing. There's also a second mechanism related to CO2 mineralization, where you react carbon dioxide with something like calcium or magnesium, and you basically form a mineral. It's like growing limestone, for example, which is what we're doing in my laboratory. So materials based on those mechanisms are, in fact, net sequesterers. They're carbon negative. You asked, Chris, about some of the most promising materials. What excites me, and really, for me, in the carbon negative space, what mass timber is doing for our market, it's really paving the way as this industrial biomaterial that's being used in new and innovative ways. I know it's been around for a while, but each success story with a new mass timber project gets us a step closer. But really, the new emerging materials that I think are really exciting are those derived from alternate biomass sources. So high performance insulation from hemp or straw, or even materials made from algae that we're working on in my laboratory. We're growing, we're actually using algae that do both. They store carbon through photosynthesis, but they also make minerals. We're growing algae-based concrete and commercializing it. So we have startup companies that are commercializing a number of technologies in my lab. So I think, I think I will say this time and time again that we're at this critical turning point. We're seeing a lot of demand from the industry, which is helping to pull these new technologies. And so to see a concept like Urban Sequoia really be brought to life, like it's really not just a vision. It is something that I believe will lay the groundwork for other inspirational building projects to come.
I'm so glad that you started with the distinction of embodied versus operational carbon, and I think that some of the audience may be very well versed in that, some may not, but it's gotten complicated because we have been talking about operational carbon, the carbon that requires to run the building, the energy most related to the energy use of the building. But now we understand the impact of embodied carbon. So all of the materials, the construction, the making of all the materials, the transport to the site, the construction of the building, and that often that footprint is quite large relative to the operational, because the industry has gotten quite good at regulating operational carbon. We actually focused on it. We've addressed this. We've made change, but we now have realized the impact of embodied carbon. And I think that this project is intended to recognize the whole life cycle or the total embodied carbon, total carbon for a building, and develop a system that works us towards a negative footprint, right? That's the whole premise of this, is recognizing both embodied and operational and working towards this net carbon storing or net carbon negative. So it's a big shift in thinking. Chris, historically, as we just were saying, the path to net zero has been largely focused on energy use. And we've learned in that process that the first step is reduction. And then often we go towards renewable energy sources to get us to zero. And so, that's a concept of design, reduction, and then implementation of technology similar to the steps that Yasemin outlined for this project. It'd be great if you could help us understand the technology's role in active absorption of carbon. It sounds too good to be true, frankly, and this kind of carbon machine. But so what can technology do here, and how can this actually be integrated into building construction?
Yeah, great. Really, so great to hear from Yasemin, Wil as well. Really exciting work and perspective. And the order that you laid out is the correct one. It should be designing for low energy use, clean energy, maximizing embodied carbon reduction through material changes, and then the frosting, or the last margin, which would also really allows us to go deeply negative or restorative, as some call it, is taking carbon out of the air. And so buildings, as Wil just described, can be comprised of a growing, portfolio of existing and novel materials that become carbon stores, but they can also be increasingly, we think, look to a future where their buildings or the built environment are, active operational sites of carbon removal. And there are a range of actual technologies. It's amazing to be an observer and a participant of this space, that it seems like every week there's some new research paper that I come across, or a new company that's being started that represents a novel form of active carbon removal. But the one that you probably hear about most, that is received the most attention with good reason, is direct air capture, or DAC, or direct air carbon capture. And so these are technologies that are purpose-built to to absorb carbon from the ambient air. And what we've seen, I've been in the carbon removal space for about 5 years, coming from a career in solar. For a while, there was sort of a steady class of about 4 companies with lots of renderings and pitch decks and things like that. But over the last year, you've seen this, Cambrian explosion of, not only different companies. I sit on the board of the Direct Air Capture Coalition, and we have 24 DAC companies that are our members. And that's probably about a third of the companies that are known now. So there's been this explosion of companies, and upstream of that, observing the research that's being done is even more breathtaking in some ways. Just the very novel directions and sorbent discovery and performance increases, different ways of thinking about utilization of direct air capture and optimizing it. So it's a really exciting thing. And solar moved fast. I saw that happen. This is moving at lightning speed by comparison. But one of the things that's really interesting, I would say, about direct air capture, it has a long way to go. We are at the very earliest stages, and there's significant, economic and performance barriers that have to be overcome related to cost, and certainly related to both embodied energy and certainly operational energy. These are real challenges that have to be overcome. But what I think is interesting and maybe most pertinent to tonight's discussion, that we're talking about the built environment, is that in the early conceptual days of direct air capture, even until relatively recently, they were conceived almost in reference, they were almost sort of anti-power plants. They were thought of as things that had to be inherently large, complex, centralized industrial systems. And absolutely, that is a part of the spectrum that will be really significant to the future of direct air capture, because there's certain advantages, obviously, economies of scale. But what we've seen more recently is a different approach, which is a lot more like where I come from, solar and battery storage, that is premised on more modular, simple, more solid state types of deployments that are, again, elementally more simple and then operationally more simple. I was happy to hear a DAC company the other day. I was like, well, what is it like to kind of maintain one of these in a building? And he was like, basically an HVAC guy could sort of maintain it. And that's great news. But what I think is exciting about the proliferation of more modular and simple technologies is not just the economic benefits that come. That type of profile for technology tends to be see cost reduction much faster because of what we call accelerated learning rates. But the other thing that's really, really interesting about it is that when you make something small, modular, and simple, you democratize or liberate who can think about using it, not just as an adopter, but as a creative implementer or as a designer. So you have this sort of crossover of DAC from something that was exclusive by design and concept, large commercial things that only a relatively small number of actors could really intervene in and influence, to something that could potentially be distributed across multiple different sectors and hacked and played with and changed. And that's where I think architecture is incredibly exciting, because there's this question of where is the direct air capture going to go? And when I think of architecture as a craft and an art and a practice, it's about taking this technology and placing it in the world. And rather than looking at DAC as this separate thing, almost like a landfill out there, can we look at direct air capture more as an embedded quality of things, starting with buildings in the built environment? And I think the Urban Sequoia project is really the first that I know of that's gone public with that element of it, with DAC in it, that really is sort of picking up that potential and showing it to the world. So I'm really excited, not just about the technological proliferation, but the formal diversification, which allows different types of actors to get their hands on it and really determine the course of the technology.
Well, all right, that's exciting, and I love your connection of DAC, of direct air capture, to the solar revolution, really, that now we see solar panels on so many buildings, and it went from being large fields into being implemented on rooftops in the suburbs. And so wouldn't that be great if we could get to that same kind of proliferation for direct air capture?
I can correct you on one thing. It actually was the opposite. It went from small to big. And I think that's an important thing, because when we think about using DAC on buildings, that is what could potentially open up the course for it to be used, I think, on a larger scale. So just one little point to make.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Well, I'm going to pick up though on your comment where you said that adoption is happening at lightning speed by comparison to solar. So that's quite exciting, right? That gives us good hope for change.
Yeah, well, I would say it's not adoption, but the proliferation of technology and different companies. Now the adoption part has to happen. So that's yeah.
I really appreciate the clarifications, because this is what we have to do, and that takes me to maybe the to Kira and to the next point of conversation here. And and maybe we make the leap of faith that the knowledge and the materials and technologies are there and available to us, and one wants to know or think, is the industry actually ready for this shift of thinking? And I think you have your finger on the pulse here, and I think for sure we should be, but are we ready? And if not, how do we get there?
That is a very big question and an important one. And actually, so let me put this in context a little bit, because what I think is and I'm so glad that Chris mentioned the sort of small, modular, simple aspect and how that relates to adoption and replicability and all of that, because I think that those are some of the aspects of this whole scheme that I think are especially powerful at this moment right now. But just to go back a little bit. So what's really interesting about Urban Sequoia, I think, is the fact that it visualizes this positive future. It really puts it into shifts the thinking, the mindset shift that Yasemin mentioned, and then shows what that would be like. And it is doing this in a way that, demonstrates how well beyond the building we can have a carbon strategy that could really be a positive move. And it's rooted in biomimicry. Well, so I have to confess too that I am one of those geeks who read Janine Benyus's book in the late 90s, and it kind of changed my life and my thinking forever. You cannot read that book and then not have read that book. And so I'm just delighted with that sort of framing and the backdrop of that behind this as a real, the big picture part of that. Because I actually think this is about how we are framing conversations in our culture around value and what we value and where we're trying to go with this. It's not, I mean, ultimately it is, I do believe it's existential. It is about survival, but I feel like we're trying to go there in a way that is far beyond that. We are trying to make this a positive move forward. And the idea of buildings as trees and cities as forests, there are some precedents for that. I feel compelled to bring up William McDonough and Michael Braungart wrote an essay about this very thing in a book. It came out the same year as Cradle to Cradle, actually, the Catalog of the Future. And then in 2006, Fortune published the Tower of Tomorrow, the William McDonough and Partners Tower of Tomorrow, which was along these lines. But like, it was very focused on the tower and this sort of object, right? And whereas they were trying to have a conversation about the forest. And that's what I think is so powerful about this scheme and how it's trying to address all of those things. There are really important things that need to happen in tall buildings, and we need to make sure that we address those and make those replicable. But the bigger picture thinking is actually really what's going to be most influential and have the most impact throughout the industry and throughout society, honestly. And that's really when we're thinking about what's happening in the many, many low-rise buildings and all of the sites and the infrastructure, and also all of the existing buildings, because that's going to be something we really have to address. So I'm very encouraged by that whole framing of this concept. And I think that, the answer to your question, Chris, is really yes and no. This comes at a moment I actually spent last week at the American Institute of Architects conference in Chicago, which was both very inspiring on this around the answer to your question, and also less so. So I would say that I feel like there is a big move in the industry to get us to a leading edge place on these topics. And things like being able to adopt carbon removal strategies in ways, in these small, modular, and simple ways that Chris was referring to is going to be very helpful to advance that. There's a long way to go, though. The architecture industry in particular it has a client service model, and there's a lot of the clients aren't asking for it, kind of a feeling out there. And I think that is, let's put it this way, I suspect that that's not actually true. I think if we think the clients aren't asking for it, we aren't actually listening closely enough. We are not listening to what they want, what they think value is, and what they think future proofing for their businesses and their buildings should look like. So I feel like if we, as the design industry, have deeper conversations on that front, we will find that in fact they do want that value, and they are ready for it, and they are asking for it, and we'll be quite disappointed if we're not able to deliver it. So I think we will get there. It's tricky. It's interesting. I think there's this feeling that we need to bring them along, them being the clients or the public, but in fact, the awareness about climate and what's going to be happening in the fairly near term is really, really changed in the last 5 to 10 years. And it's time for the AEC field to, catch up to that and make sure that we're having sophisticated conversations and listening much more deeply to the public and to our clients, I think. And I think they're ready to see that leadership from all quarters. They understand that what the trajectory is now. I mean, the science has never been more clear. And, to quote venture capitalist John Doerr, we need the speed and the scale, and the time is right now.
All right, a lot to jump into here, and I want to pick up on a couple of the items you brought up, and then we'll and first questions, and then some others as we move forward, because there's many ways to start to attack this. We are, I think I want to point out that this is meant to be a concept, a way of thinking, not a product or a singular idea, right? And this is an idea, as you point out, Kira, it's one that's come up before, and this idea of buildings acting like trees, but the notion of going beyond net zero to sequestering is to a carbon negative is the critical change of thinking. And I think that what we're asking here is for everyone to consider the adoption of that thinking, and to find the right incentives beyond clients asking or not asking. But we think that this is a concept that is, as Yasemin pointed out, scalable. So whether this is building a pavilion, or building a 5-story building, or building a tower, and through the use of this reduction, materials, and technology, that it's a scalable idea. And I think what many people are curious about, and we're even starting to get some questions about this, and so I think we should address this, is that, and you bring it up, Kira, is that there's a lot of existing building stock. And so, if we design the perfect new system for all the new buildings, and so it is worth pointing out that there are a lot of new buildings being built in the next decade, next 2 decades. But what about all of the existing buildings? How do we truly get cities to function in a carbon negative way? And so it would be good to talk for a moment. And I think Yasemin and Chris might be able to pitch in the most here. But if we could talk about retrofit and what might be able to be thought of for existing buildings, because it is fundamental to this exercise and this concept.
Right, it's a very good question, actually. And I think many of us on in the audience, in this call and in the audience, we know that I wish there was a silver bullet And I wish we could just say, just do this and we're good. Unfortunately, that's not the case when we talk about carbon emissions and climate change. So hence us looking at multiple technologies, multiple ways, multiple scales, multiple uses. And probably the first thing that applies to existing buildings is actually maintaining them. So as you explained, Chris, there's a differentiation between embodied carbon and operational carbon. Embodied carbon coming from materials used, construction of those materials, production of those, and then operational carbon emitted during with the electricity use, the heating, the cooling, the power through the lifetime of the building. So existing buildings give us a chance to actually maintain what exists there already, meaning that we can eliminate most of that embodied carbon that comes with any new building, period. And then can we then put the emphasis on the operational side? So there's many technologies out there that we can think of now that generate energy, for example, and absorb carbon too. So generating, we can think of thermal cells, we can think of photovoltaics, we can think of carbon capturing technologies at different scales. And these are all technologies available today, actually. So retrofits, I think the advantage and the maybe opportunity in retrofits come actually from maintaining and improving what's there first, and then supplementing that with regenerative ideas. And of course, the materials that we put in for fit outs, etc., we should consider renewable materials such as timber, bamboo, hemp-based materials, bioplastic, etc., that are already low in carbon or absorb carbon actually through their lifetime.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, just narrowly looking at direct air capture and those products and approaches that are meant to be building integrated. They are designed to be integrated with existing buildings. There's some really creative approaches. One company that I'm very fond of, I just was speaking with the CEO a couple of days ago, is a Bay Area-based company called Noya, which actually the chemical trigger for the capturing is it's integrated with cooling towers on roofs. So they were actively looking at where is there existing common infrastructure that's out there that we can piggyback on. And that the other thing about being in buildings is Yasemin mentioned this early on, she's talking about the stack effect, but what are the dynamics of buildings? What are the waste streams of buildings, and how do those line up actually with what a DAC machine needs to actually swing or cycle carbon, heat, water, moisture. So there's really interesting ways in which these self-contained DAC modules can be integrated into buildings. We just had another company on our weekly podcast today called Soltair in Finland, and they integrate with HVAC systems. So they're directly pulling carbon from the HVAC system, integrates directly into to the basement of commercial buildings. So it's interesting to see how they're thinking of where to put their boxes. And again, it reminds me a lot of my journey through battery storage and solar. Similar kinds of constraints around fire codes and building department things, but definitely can be added to existing and new construction.
I want to ask maybe a detail, and I think this is for Wil and for you, Chris, and maybe following straight what you're describing is, what happens to the carbon, and that maybe even I follow this up, Yasemin, if you might add to this, but I think that there's different answers for this, right? With a carbon sequestering material is one answer, for technology is another answer, but ultimately, where does the carbon go? Or, what is how do we get to negative?
Yeah, I can take a swing. So this is a really important question. I could teach an entire semester or two on temporary and permanent carbon storage in the materiality of our built infrastructure. But there's a difference between photosynthetic storage of carbon and mineralized storage of carbon. In photosynthetic systems, just like tree, this is the best example. The storage of carbon is temporary because the tree takes in CO2, gaseous CO2, converts that to sugars like cellulose, hemicellulose, and it's stored there. And you're maybe thinking to yourself, well, a lot of things can happen to that tree at the end of its useful life. Now, again, I can talk at length about this, but we often have to make assumptions as to where that carbon goes when we do whole building life cycle assessment and we're trying to really understand whole life carbon emissions. But when we think about products like mass timber, glulam, CLT, at the end of their useful life, okay, 50 to 100 years in the future, my hypothesis is that carbon is going to be way too valuable. The storage of the carbon is going to be way too valuable for us to continue our business as usual disposal practices. We're going to see a lot less carbon going to landfills, a lot less being incinerated. There are going to be incentive programs, which I can get into. There was a question about economics and carbon markets, but there's going to be incentive programs to keep the carbon stored, even if it's temporary. I like to talk a little bit too about temporary storage and how it helps to flatten the curve of carbon dioxide emissions. So however temporary, 50 to 100 years, it's still stored permanently in those materials, and buildings are the perfect vehicle for long-lived carbon storage because they're decades long service lives. So it's a good strategy, regardless of in 50 to 100 years, regardless where that is going to go. Mineralized storage doesn't have the same problem because calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate is just much more stable in mineral form, and the disposal of those materials that have that mineralized storage doesn't, when you landfill limestone, it doesn't off-gas CO2, unlike photosynthetic biomass. So on the material side of things, those are my thoughts around where the CO2 is, where it's released, where it could be released, carbon leakage kind of concepts. But I think, yeah, I'm interested to hear Chris's take on this too, in terms of the active systems, the DAC systems.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I look at this again, like everything through sort of a solar lens. When just looking at direct air capture, the route that it had to take over history in terms of where it was able to add value at different scales is what kept it alive and made it a very resilient industry. So everything from oil and gas to space to off-grid marijuana growing, toys, and that was how it actually got to a certain scale where it could even be conceived of being a real serious provider of electricity. And along that course, the price went down and the best practices increased, and we converged on a dominant technology. And so when I look at DAC and I look at buildings, it's not immediate that you're going to have an actual carbon removal, I think, for most DAC utilization. You're going to have a carbon utilization. So you could, where could DAC plug into buildings to add value right now? So in the beverage industry, for instance, with beer making, with urban agriculture, with greenhouses, with synthetic fuel production. The company that I just mentioned, Soltaire, they have an onboard electrolyzer. So they're able to combine basically carbon and hydrogen and make a synthetic fuel that's like natural gas that would substitute for natural gas. Now, again, those are circular applications, but in the process of those penetrating, you're starting to bring the cost down of direct air capture. And then you're freeing people to think, what else can I do with carbon dioxide? And then there's also the utilization of carbon dioxide in concrete, as we see the growing carbon utilization sector, carbon curing, carbon-based aggregates. There's a way to take that carbon and use it within the urban environment. But what I'm excited about is something that's hinted at in Urban Sequoia is, again, as carbon becomes more prolific, our ability to pull it out of the air, will that open up, people like Wil, for instance, who are trying to make these materials that are carbon-based? We have a citizen science project right now that Wil would get a kick out of that is a little micro mineralizer that we've connected with a small DAC machine. And that accelerates the rate of calcium hydroxide turning into calcium carbonate, right? And in Urban Sequoia, there's this idea, could the building not only be removing carbon, but making stuff that you build the next layers and parts of the urban environment? So for me, that is the long game. When we're not talking about geological sequestration, which really isn't part of the urban picture, is can we actually get to a point where we're making carbon fiber, we're making carbon enhanced bio bricks, and we're actually able to locally produce those and use those to build new things? To me, that is a fascinating way to link that carbon storing materials with active carbon in the built environment.
And it's kind of ironic, actually, that, you know, I don't know if you recall this, but a couple of months ago, actually, we were talking about what a tragic level our carbon emissions have reached, CO2 emissions have reached. Yet in Europe, many countries actually has had a shortage of CO2. Therefore, the food and beverage industry, which required carbon for carbonization, were actually having to slow down operations. So it's interesting that I think the solution to this is that this is not at a building scale only. I think this is about linking different scales together, thinking of at the building scale, but also at the district, at the city, at the general zone, and really thinking about this in a different way. Could we imagine a world where, for example, carbon captured by some of these technologies is actually collected just like a commodity? It's collected like waste. And they're actually directed to certain plants that actually process these, creates other materials, use in the food and beverage industry. And I think that's really the potential of this.
I'm glad you brought that up, Yasmin, because there is, and I can't believe I'm forgetting his name, but there is a thinker in this space who is looking at a kind of a district heating model, right? Where if you have major emitters that are difficult to abate, that are going to require capture, sort of the backbone that justifies some sort of distribution system within a dense area for carbon. But if you had that, you could have certain people that plug into that network that aren't putting their carbon in there, they're taking it to make sneakers or things like that. You know, if you have this sort of underlying flow of carbon that becomes both a waste material and an input for other things, is a really, really exciting vision, I think.
All right, I want to talk for a minute about incentives. And then I want to take a couple of specific questions from the audience, because there are a couple coming in that we haven't hit. But you know, as we pivot this to how do we make this happen? How do we push this forward? And I don't mean we, but how does society push this forward? And I think that you know, it'd be great to talk about incentives. Kira, you touched on, you know, clients aren't asking for it. But we are, you know, we could certainly argue necessity is an incentive. Maybe, but how do we pique interest? How do we pique investment? Is it policy? You know, there are a lot. I think there's a lot of ways to push at this, but what do we think are the most effective? And maybe Kira, actually, I might point to you to start this. And I know that I suspect others are going to have good points to make here. But how do we? What is the right path to push?
I think this is going to sound like a lame answer, actually, but all of them. I think we have to do all of them, because what we are trying to get to is a cultural shift. That mindset shift that Yasemin was talking about with respect to, you know, a completely different way of thinking about building. What we're actually after here is a completely different understanding culturally of, in this case, carbon and emissions, and how we function on this planet with respect to that, right? I mean, that sounds kind of a little bit macro to say it that way, but I really do think it has a lot to do with many things about the way that we live, the way that we build, and the way that we create products, the way that we use products, how we think about waste. All of those things are related to this. So the main thing I would say is that we have to be having more conversations about that to begin to make that shift collectively. And so it will take policy, it will take some regulation, it will take some of the industries and sectors that are a little bit behind. I actually think that when the insurance industry catches up just a tiny bit, we're going to see things move quite a bit more quickly. You know, so there are different sectors that will help advance that conversation, but I think we have to be ready to have it all along the spectrum and be really willing to engage everybody. So this is not a big companies are going to save the planet conversation. This is everyone, right? So it is going to be, some of it will be engaging with people who are, typically early adopters and want to have things on their houses that do certain things. So the same people that got solar really early, right? So there will be some of that, but we also have to think about how that's going to happen in the context of, this is a major economic transformation that's going to be happening. And we have to address what that means socially as well at the same time. So we have to be mindful and have open conversations all along the way about what it looks like to include everyone in that conversation. That is what the just transition will look like. And the best way we can do that to be inclusive and fair is to have those really broad conversations across sectors as early and as often and as inclusively as possible.
Well, actually, I see we're getting even a question from somebody who mentions in government today in our country, can we imagine that this is possible? Seeing what we're seeing, I think that's a powerful question. We also have to think, and we're seeing this not just some of these issues, not just in our country, but in other countries as well. Chris, I wonder if you might actually push us towards some optimism here, because I think you have been personally involved in pushing forward some policy and that falls into this category.
Yeah, I there is reasons for optimism. I mean, policy is tough. Legislative processes are tough. It's a difficult political moment for the country, to say the least. But I think a couple reasons for optimism is that we have to look at the global picture and the things that are arising outside of the United States. And we also have to really look at the subnational level. I think what states and even what municipalities can drive is really significant. And that's where we focus most of our efforts at OpenAir, and the policies that we developed in legislation have been mostly carbon removal support bills at the state municipal level. But the other thing is what we're finding is that sort of uniquely in American political life, carbon dioxide removal is actually a relatively bipartisan pursuit. Now, you might argue with what is the other side, whatever side you're on, what's in it for them, and certainly there's a diversity of motivations behind it. But we have legislation right now that's introduced in Congress, the CREST Act. It's bipartisan. Susan Collins of Maine, a Republican, and Senator Cantwell of Washington introduced it. It's an excellent policy. And the other bill that we're pushing for, the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act, our members are out there in the country talking to every single hue of red and blue, and are getting really interesting responses. So I do think that there is a middle ground there that carbon removal occupies that is, I think, really generating a really interesting and somewhat hopeful political response. So, and I'll actually add one thing: the bill that we are pushing for in New York, also the Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act. There was a poll that was done by Data for Progress a month ago. 82% approval for carbon removal among Democrats, 68 among Republicans. So it was something that was, again, it was on the plus for both sides.
That's optimistic. Will, I saw you had taken yourself off mute earlier. I didn't know if you want to add in on this conversation about incentives or.
Yeah, I do have a couple of thoughts. So if you think about the traditional levers of getting building owners to do the right thing, right? We do have the elective green building programs like LEED and now zero carbon, ILFI. But owners have to pay, and the buildings are often a little bit more expensive, right? So that gets limited traction. And with policies, as Chris alluded to, and Kira mentioned, like these are necessary. They're slow, but we're seeing some uptake with the Buy Clean bills that are being adopted in some states. So really, when we think about our industry, it is a commodity market, and we live in a capitalist society. So a financial incentive is going to be a huge driver. So one of my startups, Aureus Earth, is really trying to architect a financial lever for building owners to profit from making the right decisions early in the design process. Now you can equate this to like the solar rebates, right? In the early days, and even today, to incentivize people to make the investment to install solar. The same idea can be applied early in a design process if a builder wants to build out of concrete or mass timber, and they're looking at the bottom line and they're saying it does not pencil out. In some cases it does pencil out, in some cases it doesn't. So why not incentivize them to make a material choice that actually flips the building to a carbon sink? And either they could take credit for that if they are an owner that purchases carbon offsets, or they could sell that to help offset the cost. We're about to complete our very first pilot in a building in the Pacific Northwest. We'll be releasing a lot more information about this pretty soon, but it really, we believe every industry is going to be involved in the carbon markets in some form or fashion in the next decade. And we just want to make sure for the building industry that we do it right from the get-go. So just wanted to mention that dollars do go a long way.
And actually, I would like to add one thing here. It's a different kind of incentive, but it's still an incentive particularly for the private sector. You know, and I don't know if you've seen this, but 90%, in some of the surveys that were done, 92% of Gen Z stated that they will actually switch to a provider that has higher ESG goals, E in the ESG meaning environmental goals. So this is not for that generation. This is not an optional thing. Many of them see this as a way of living. This kind of approach is actually fundamental to their lifestyle. And what this means also that it's, you know, it is a push from the government with policies, with penalties and incentives, but it's also pull from the private sector, right? With this kind of incentives, and to incentivize employees to attract the best talent, maintain it, and also for their accountability. So I think we're seeing the pull and the push at this moment in time, and that's really exciting for the future.
And Chris, it's worth also adding that we know how to do policy to accelerate innovation. One of the first things you will hear about carbon removal is it's so expensive right now. Of course it's expensive, it's new, right? But from the middle of the 20th century onward, through our procurement practices, through targeted R&D, through tax incentives, through rebates, through tariff structures, we figured out a suite of tools that we know can accelerate things. And all of those are broadly applicable to the various different forms of carbon dioxide removal. So we know what kind of policy we could try to put in place here. We're not starting from scratch there, which I think is important.
Yeah, right. Let's learn from what we've seen work. I often wonder too about, the commitments that have already been made. That we know that cities have made commitments. There's these ideas of being net zero by 2050. That cities around the globe have made this commitment, and so to get there is actually going to require a real effort. And it seems that should also be an incentive here. That to get your city to that point, you're going to have to start actually offsetting, so to speak. You're gonna have to start sequestering, and so we have to. Some of this is maybe about putting, connecting the dots of some commitments that are already made, and trying to use architecture to help us get there. There was a question that came up that I see actually from Nixon, and Chris started to respond to that about being an architect in Africa, right? And so how does this concept relate to vernacular architecture? How does this concept relate to architecture in all different climates and different different conditions? And I think it would be interesting to talk a little bit about that also from a building point of view. And I wonder, I kind of point to Wil, I wonder even from a materials point of view, if there's a way of addressing that.
Absolutely. Again, I have a lot to say, but I'll keep it short. One thing that I like to impress upon every architect who's making material decisions is to really understand the fiber vernacular of the region in which you're building. And what I mean by that is trees are great. Not all regions of the world have forests, but most of the regions of the world have some agricultural practice. We leave in the United States, we leave millions of tons of sunflower stalks and bagasse fiber just there to decompose and release their CO2 back into the atmosphere. So there's an opportunity in every region around the world to understand the fiber vernacular and to encourage local material manufacturing to transform that waste material into a building product. So that's sort of one part of the answer there. The other part is, for any new solution, it's extremely important for the building industry for it to be cost competitive, economical, affordable, globally available. It's why I'm so enamored by algae and have been for the better part of a decade now, because you can grow algae pretty much anywhere. It doesn't require a lot. It needs sunlight and water. And you can do a lot with it. And it can spur a lot of different industries: food, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, biofuels, and also what we're showing is you can make materials out of it. So I think that would be my perspective, but I'm curious to hear others as well.
I think that's great. I think that we are actually getting towards close here, and so if there's any last questions, I encourage the group to put those in. And then I'm going to ask if any of the speakers want to make a closing comment. Let's see. All right. So how can society scientists motivate big corporations to have a small environmental footprint? So that is back to the incentives. That's a question that's here. Is can we how do we motivate big corporations? I think there's an answer to this. And I think it is, and Yasemin, maybe I'll let you jump into this, or Kira. But I think we're starting to see movement here.
I think it's an accountability probably issue mostly, and the last couple of years have been quite traumatic for many, probably with the pandemic, but also this has changed our society and our life in many ways. And throughout this process, we also learned, I think, the good. We reassessed the good and the bad. We reassessed the right and the wrong. We reassess what does well-being mean, what does sustainable mean. And as part of this, I think many in this society, we actually looked at the choices that we make as individuals for our lifestyle, but also for companies we support, for products we purchase. And as part of this, I think there's a big movement in the private sector that ESGs mean a lot these days. ESGs are significant, actually, a piece of the corporate commitment. And as a result, we are seeing a significant change. And what we can do is we can support that. As end users, we have a choice. We all have as individuals, we have a choice. And we can also let them know the appreciation that not just what they do, but also appreciation that we have for some of those incentives. And a couple of days ago, these are in the supermarkets. There's actually zero carbon milk you can buy, for example. So these products are becoming more and more available. And as consumers, we all have a choice from that scale of the daily produce to energy providers, to houses and apartments that we buy. So I think it goes in many scales that we have an influence as individuals here.
I would agree with that. Just real quickly, I think there might be some other questions we want to touch on, but just real quickly, totally agree with the public, the consumer, and really demanding that kind of accountability. I mean, that will be the incentive, right? That's the incentive that we're talking about without even making a policy for an incentive, although we certainly can afford to do that. I think that even with the ESG right now, and there's a lot of interesting things happening in that realm, that could be a whole separate topic, but it is going to be the consumer's responsibility to hold, to protect against greenwashing. And to raise its own, we have to raise the public awareness and intelligence around carbon and around all the aspects of ESG to make sure that everybody can be an informed consumer and really demand what we actually want, which is something that will safeguard quality of life, and in a broad, the broad definition thereof. So good point.
There is a question from Dominique about retrofitting urban road and transportation networks. And Yasmin, I'm gonna ask you to take a stab at this. and that, because I think that it is a, we're talking about buildings, and we're also talking about cities. So what is this? What about the space between the buildings? Can it be part of of this?
Yeah, it's a big piece of the puzzle, right? And it's a big piece of the puzzle for a couple of reasons. The first one is, I mean, transportation has a huge carbon footprint, and it really makes a difference. Do we travel in a private car? Do we share rides? Do we use public transport? And I think as architects and city planners, these are the issues that we confront every day. These are the issues that we think about every day. And I think it's gonna become more and more prevalent to think about in this fashion as well. But in that space also, some of these technologies that we're talking about could also apply there. Some of these innovative materials, low carbon materials, is things we can use there. And actually, the policy that Chris mentioned, the carbon leadership policy in New York State, for example, recognizes that the New York State is actually the biggest carbon concrete purchaser in the state, and is trying to reduce the impact of that by introducing an incentive policy that gives incentive to low carbon concrete, for example. So there's already attention coming to this space. And I think we're going to see some of these technologies, some of these innovative materials to come into that space as well. There's no reason why some of these carbon capturing ideas couldn't apply into that space also. And I think one more thing there we shouldn't forget about is the natural sequestration. We should not forget the impact of nature when we talk about sequestration. Yes, it's not huge, but it makes a difference. So correct landscaping, correct green spaces, maximizing them, optimizing them also can make a big difference, not just for carbon, but also for daily life of individuals in those in-between spaces also.
Thanks, Yasmin. I am going to try to hit some of these questions. There's someone brought up that in my experience in the A&E industry, we can only build what someone pays us to build. And this is an interesting comment. And this is, Kira, you touched on this earlier. and how do we reconcile the difference between what's being asked for and what needs to happen? And I think that I might even start to answer this to say that there are a lot of tools at our disposal in the A&E industry. We already have many tools that we can implement. And so some of this falls on to us as our responsibility to implement the tools that we have, and to do the research on what we are building, and maybe even step one, work to design buildings that are much that have a lower embodied carbon. And all, those tools are I'm glad that we keep seeing Joseph from Wholesome weighing in, because Wholesome is doing great research with concrete, which is, as in the architecture industry, we are using a lot of concrete. And so understanding what's available to us and working with that and specifying that is critical to, that's our responsibility. It's not even our client's responsibility. Anyway, I don't think I'm supposed to be the one answering the questions, but I want to, maybe if somebody else wants to address that, how do we in the industry deal with the discrepancy?
I'll try to take a stab at first. Some of the reduction tools we have available to us right now are actually, they don't come with an extra cost. It's about how we spec things. It's about where the materials come from. So I think that's the first step. So it's right to assume that, yes, a client, of course, a project with a higher goal should perform better. However, that doesn't mean that all the other ones should be bad or should not perform well. For example, local materials. They have huge benefits, and their carbon footprint is much, much, much lower than their distant alternatives. And often they do not actually have a cost increase because they're locally sourced probably. Other things like, for example, recycled content of building materials. They do not have cost premium often. In fact, some of them are actually cheaper than their virgin alternatives. Things like concrete technologies, using recycled content, fly ash, or even carbon cure, sometimes don't have additional costs either, because, for example, the carbon cure concrete comes at a higher strength. It could then mean that you're actually reducing the quantity of concrete used. So actually, the delta in between traditional concrete versus a low carbon concrete could be quite small. So I think we have to think of this in a couple of levels, that what can we do as designers to reduce immediately with no cost impact and with no additional goal? That's step one. Then in addition to that, how can we communicate to our clients and not just clients, industry, consultants, our peers, manufacturers, the importance of this and what kind of difference they can make and what this could mean for them. And I suspect that with those in mind, we are seeing that we can push some of these goals further up, even for those that might start with nothing on the table. And I think that's the approach that we can take. And the better we are at that, the better products we're going to end up as well.
I completely agree with that, of course, because you're suggesting communications is a major part of that. And that is obviously my area. So, but it is true. And I've seen it work time and again. And if you meet the client, the owner, the community where they are on the topic, and that might mean in certain regions of the country that you never use the word sustainability or climate or any of those words, but you're purely talking about what their issue is with their site, their building, and what they value, and then bring value to them that factors in these issues. That's all we have to do. It's not actually that complicated. It's a process of, you have to be inventive, but that's what we're supposed to be doing anyway. That's the job. So I think that it's just a matter of framing value in their terms. And because that's what you would be delivering when you're bringing a climate intelligent solution to any design problem, any scale.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I mean, the importance of this stage at those niches that become your footholds to really get to a certain scale. And that's not only the niches of clients that explicitly want climate-friendly products, but if you look at DAC, as I mentioned before, there's a real merchant carbon problem. It's extremely expensive to get carbon for beverages and for other materials. It's very volatile as well. So something like a direct air capture system solves a problem. It would give you consistent, reliable source of CO2. And the key is to try to find those places where you add value right now as a sort of a way to proceed and get bigger and get cheaper. That's the real key.
All right. Fantastic. I think that I think the message here is that there's a role for each of us in this. And there's so much available to us right now that we can make, certainly in the A&E industry, make a difference. So, and there's not a choice, is the fact here. But with that, I think we hit our limit. We were we had a target of 7:45, and we've well surpassed, which is fantastic, actually. And it's such a great topic, and I feel like we could keep going forever. But I really want to thank Yasemin, Kira, Wil, Chris, for everything you're doing, and for joining us here tonight. Outstanding. Jacqueline, I think we're closing our panel, and so thank you also to the National Building Museum for hosting us.
Thank you for this incredible program and this amazing conversation. And we want to send another thank you to our sponsors for making this program possible. And I also want to thank our audience for attending. And we need your feedback. So you will receive a survey where you can share your valuable thoughts on this program. And I truly hope you'll take a few minutes to complete it. Please note this discussion was recorded and an edited version will be available for free to view on our website within 10 business days. Please do not hesitate to spread the word and share this incredible conversation. Thank you again for joining us.